Okay, in this video I'm going to give a walkthrough of my blog. I'm going to kind of explain how to use it and hopefully point out some features that would be interesting to people. So it's called chiply.dev. I've just typed that into Google, so I'm going to click on this and that'll take us to the home page. And we can see the home page has a few different elements here. Probably what catches the eye the quickest is this knowledge graph here on the right. And this knowledge graph really represents the content that's on my blog, and any of these purple nodes here represent posts. And then the green nodes represent tags. So tags are related to posts because posts can contain tags, and then posts can directly link to each other as well. And so these are all of the relationships as defined by those tags and direct links between posts. This is a really interactive graph. It's by default, it spins to make it look visually impressive, but you can click anywhere on the graph to stop the spinning. And you can also zoom in and zoom out by scrolling. There are usage instructions up here. You can zoom in and zoom out. You can hover over the purple nodes to get a summary of what's in that node. And I won't do this now, but you can also click on the post nodes to take you to that article that the node represents. You can also rotate this to get a better view. It's very interactive. Typically, if you can't kind of get your mouse to what you want to get it to, you can usually make it a little bit more accessible by changing the view by rotating the graph here. And you can zoom in as much as you like, and then you can zoom out as much as you like as well. And if you find that maybe you've put this into a view where things are too difficult to see, here we can see that the knowledge graph is really, really tiny in this area. You can just click the reset button and it'll zoom you back into that default view. So that's the knowledge graph. The only really usable knowledge graph in here is the explicit knowledge graph. Again, this represents the literal posts, direct links between them, and relationships as defined by tags and any tags that might be shared across posts. So those are explicit relationships. As an experimental feature, I've also included semantic relationships here. So this is actually doing some text mining for things like, we do actually include the literal posts, but we also include concepts that we've mined out of the text in the posts themselves. So we have things like themes, topics, and key phrases. You can still click on the posts here, but outside of that, this graph is probably more aesthetically pleasing than it is usable. I'm hopefully going to fix that over time as I learn a little bit more about these knowledge graphs and how to make them sort of useful interactive artifacts as opposed to simply kind of like pretty looking data visualizations. This semantic graph has different levels of depth. Currently we're at 3, but if you wanted to render something that was a little bit simpler, you can decrease the level of depth and you'll notice that you'll have far fewer nodes in this graph and things might become easier to reason about. We also have an LLM graph. This is similar to how we've mined out concepts from the text, except we're having an LLM mine out the concepts for us. We're basically feeding it all of the post data and we're asking it to extract themes, topics, and key phrases. And this also has different levels of depth, so you can view the knowledge graph at various degrees of granularity. So that's the knowledge graph. Down here, you'll see these things called pulses. These are inspired by the glyph that you'll see on your GitHub profile that represents the number of contributions you've made per day. So a similar theme there, and this is actually pulling data from GitHub commits, and I'll explain the purpose of each in a minute. But the difference between what's on GitHub and what we have here is that I've got various timescales here. So I think GitHub breaks it down by days, so that would be a view like this, whereas I've included weeks, months, quarters, and years. So you can get all of these various timescales if you want, which is pretty cool. So what do each of these represent? So there's a dev pulse, a post pulse, and a release pulse. So a dev pulse is basically any time I make a change to the repo that this blog is built from, that commit will show up here in the dev pulse. So that's quite useful. This gives a good sense of how much I'm iterating on the actual blog itself as a sort of content management and content delivery system. And again, you can view it at different timescales. The more purple the node, the darker purple, the more commits were made on that day. And the lighter, the fewer commits. You can actually see a legend here. So that's quite useful. I typically leave this at the month level. It's early days for the blog right now. So we see a whole bunch of commits for January, 371. It's been a busy month. And then 3 commits for February, as we're only a couple days in. And you can actually scroll in these hoverovers as well. Part of the reason I've put this here is that for security reasons, the repo is private. I will eventually open source it as a content management system targeted towards people who want to do technical diaries or digital journalism. But for now, you wouldn't be able to see this pulse of development because the repo is private. But you can see all that data here because I'm pulling this this directly from GitHub. And this happens as part of the build process, and it's happening securely with authentication and things like that. So you can see the data, you just can't see the GitHub repository itself. So that's the dev pulse. The post pulse and the release pulse are perfectly analogous, except they represent a subset of the commits. The dev pulse contains all of the commits, whereas the post pulse only has commits that are relevant to me changing a post. So if I'm actually updating a narrative in one of these posts, one of those commits will show up here in the post pulse. And then the release pulse, similarly, it's a filtered subset of all of the commits. And these commits are only the ones where I'm actually releasing a new version of the blog. So you can see this is a pretty clean change history. And we can see a whole bunch of patch versions being incremented here. And you can probably scroll down to see when I finally released the 0.1.0, which I did after phase 2 of user acceptance testing. Then I have a little about me section. This is quite ugly right now. I need to update this, but it kind of gives you the long and short of what the blog is about. I'm a software engineer. All of my articles are going to be about software engineering. I'm an Emacs enthusiast, and I love literate programming. We'll see a really good example of that in a minute. And I'm really into data visualizations and knowledge graphs. Most of my career has been in either the data science or data analytics or data engineering domains. And a lot of what I've done there is to basically help visualize data, mostly working on kind of application layers and data presentation layers, which is why I love putting things like this beautiful knowledge graph in here. So I'm going to reset this to the default view, and then before moving on to a post, I just want to demonstrate a couple nice accessibility features. So one of these is going to be light and dark mode. So you can toggle this, what was previously the sun and has become the moon, to basically make everything render in dark mode, which is nice. I personally use light mode for everything. Dark mode kind of burns my retinas in the same way that light mode burns other people's retinas. But you can set it to whatever you like. It's fully customizable, and I'm actually making it such that your browser will cache this setting. So if you come back to my website at a later date, it will render in dark mode, as opposed to what the default is. The first time you get to my blog, it will render either in light mode, or if you've configured your computer to be light or dark mode. I know you can do that on MacBooks. It will respond to that setting as well. So that's useful. And then another accessibility feature here is that I've got different color blindness settings. So even if you don't know, if you are colorblind and you don't know what kind of color blindness you have, you can just experiment with some of these. So for example, if we do deuteranopia here, which is very common, if you have that kind of color blindness, this will all of a sudden have become a lot more visually intuitive to you, and you'll see a much more recognizable signal in these colors. And one kind of cool shout out, if you want to read the blog, and what I like to think about is stealth mode, you can set all of the colors to grayscale here by using this setting, and then having things in dark mode. Or if you wanted it to be in light mode and also in grayscale, you can do that too. these are kind of the two modes that I read the blog in. I kind of find that grayscale gives me as much, kind of gives me detailed enough like visual encoding for things like color. And I find that if it's on the normal setting, sort of using the full rainbow can kind of add to cognitive noise, or overemphasize signals that aren't as dramatic as they would seem when they're rendered in full color. So that is the homepage. So I'm going to return the settings to normal. So light mode, normal color. And let's take a look at the posts. So this is the homepage view, obviously. There's really only one other kind of view in the blog, and that's the post view. So any post you read, including the index page, is going to be rendered in this view. So here we can see an index of posts. I have a post that basically serves as a test print for this blog. If you want to read more about the idea behind a test print, you can read this article in detail. And the route is post 0, but I've always given these intuitive titles, so we'll see that, post 0 is not very informative, but we can actually see the full title of the blog here, which is useful. And as I start scrolling through this, we'll see a lot of stuff happening in the sidelines. So you'll see things like the table of contents, updates. A lot of these elements are basically auto-scrolling, so I'm just going to keep scrolling just as kind of a visual demonstration of what's going on here. And then I'll explain exactly what each of these components in the sidelines are doing and why they're useful. So I think that kind of demonstrates the auto-scrolling feature. So I'm going to scroll all the way up again to the top. And I'll explain what each of these sideline components are. So the idea behind this user interface is to give the most contextualized reading experience possible. You can read more about the motivations for doing that in this blog post, but the basic idea is that when you're reading a document, there is a bunch of context that is typically available to you, but it's hidden from you. So a really good example of that would be something like a table of contents. If you're reading a book, anything that has an index in the front of it, you are always at a particular part of that table of contents. And knowing exactly where you are can help to contextualize the text you're reading. Right? So if you pick up a book after a while, you might forget where you are. You might forget where the piece of text you're currently reading fits into the broader narrative of the full structure or of the full document you're reading. And that can be really helpful to reorient you to exactly where you are in the document. It's also helpful in long documents to know where you are. And typically the table of contents is used sort of as a reference. And even in websites, it's typically this static component where you can go through and you can sort of explore your way around and potentially click on a section that interests you to jump to it. You can do that with this table of contents as well, but it auto follows you. So it's actually providing that context for you. All of these components, I refer to them as a heads up display. And there is a section of this document that explains that. So you could jump to that section if you wanted to read a little bit more about the motivation behind this and more in detail about what each component provides and what problem it solves. So I won't go too much in detail over the other components. I'll just explain what they are. So below the table of contents, we have footnotes. Below the footnotes, we have references. This serves almost as like a bibliography or a works cited or a further reading list. Any link, specifically any external link that I mentioned in this blog, is included in this references list down here, and you can click on these at any time to go to that reference. Going up anti-clockwise, here we have a TLDR. So this is actually a summarization of the document, but it also contains links, right? So when the relevant section of the document is being read, the link will actually auto scroll. So this is useful in the two ways. Again, a lot of these things can be used two ways. One is providing context around what you're currently reading in the document. The other one is to be able to explore the content a little bit more. The TLDR is allowing us to explore the document at a higher level of summarization. and then focus in on specific things that we might be interested in reading, for example, interactive data visualizations with Python. Then we can see things like forward links and backlinks. This is terminology borrowed from the knowledge graph domain, or the personal knowledge management domain. So things like Obsidian, Orgrome, Logseek all have this notion of forward links where you can link to another post that's in your kind of corpus of posts. And then a backlink, which is any post that links to this one. So we can see that intuitively, one of the backlinks here is the index of posts page. And then forward links are any posts that I've explicitly linked to with this post. And this feature isn't what literally builds the explicit knowledge graph that we saw on the home page, but that graph is representing these kinds of explicit relationships. Above the back and forward links, we have tags. Tags are applied at the heading level because all of these documents are coming out of Emacs org mode. And so we can see, let me scroll to, so here we can see two headings that have tags. This one has the org mode tag. This one has the HUD or heads up display tag. And again, just like all the other components, we can see these are highlighted when that content is on the screen. And also usefully, we can hover over, it's kind of hard to see, I might need to fix this styling. But if we hover over tags, we can see if there are any related articles, we can see those listed here. And so we can sort of use this as a discovery vector to find posts that are related by the notion of sharing one of the tags that's in this document. And again, that's also represented in the explicit knowledge graph on the home page. To the right of those elements, we have what's called a minimap. This was hilariously difficult to implement properly because you need to keep the styling and proportions of this main article, which is what the minimap is visualizing. You need to keep those roughly in line, or well, exactly in line with what is in the minimap. So keeping those styling, especially when you're factoring in things like all the fancy text that's here, you know, the images, how they get rendered, the interactive visualizations, other things that might get lazy loaded, like mermaid charts. There was a lot of details and a lot of complexity to manage to get this minimap set up properly. But the motivation behind this is that it gives you kind of a bird's eye view of the document. And sometimes if I'm reading a document that's very long, like this one, I might remember, for example, visually where something is, or I might remember, let's say, for example, okay, I remember that there's Plotly charts, but I don't want to scroll through at a coarse grain through the main article. I can come over here to the minimap. I can just scroll intuitively to, okay, here, this is where the Plotly charts are, and then I can click on the minimap, and then it takes me to that part of the document. I use that all the time, especially for some of these narratives that are extremely long. So those are the heads up components. Okay, so this is explained in the article under this section, where did all this text come from? But to just give you kind of the long and short of it, all of the text that I write, when I'm narrating this, it's all done in what's called org mode, which is a program that runs inside of Emacs. Org mode is great for many reasons. Not only does it exist inside of Emacs, which makes it very easy to operate, but it also just has a lot of really useful features that I cannot enumerate here. You can follow this link if you want to learn more about org mode, but the relevant features are essentially the ability to create these narratives and manage the complexity of these narratives in a very, very ergonomic way. You can kind of think about it like Markdown on steroids. And then it also has this literate programming feature, which allows me to write code and render the output such that I can create incredibly rich documents without having to sort of write programs and then manually stitch the output of those programs into a narrative. It's all the same thing. It's all in the same narrative. Even when you see things like interactive charts that are going to be rendered in here, like if I scroll down the page to something like this, this is actually all defined in line with Python code. I haven't included the Python code here, but I just write the code that generates this chart, and then I link to this chart. It's as simple as that, and then it renders here insofar, I have had to set the framework up to render charts in a specific way and to make sure that they're optimized and things like that. But it is as simple as simply writing some code, executing that code in line, it spits out the result, and then both things get exported into your final document. So it's incredibly convenient from that point of view. Again, if you want to read more about org mode and why it's so useful, you can follow the org mode link here. It's down here in the references section, or it's up here in the first section. Massively recommend it. Probably not something you'd want to get into if you don't use Emacs, or if you're willing to use it, kind of only use that part of Emacs, because Emacs is a whole universe in and unto itself. But yeah, that essentially answers the question of where this text is coming from. And if you wanted to see what these org mode documents actually look like, you can see that here. So this is actually the narrative that I like. This is the artifact that I work on in order to produce what you see in front of you, including, by the way, the table of contents, the footnotes, the tags, the forward backlinks, the TLDR, the references. All of that is in this like super easy to maintain contiguous narrative. And then my blogging framework renders it all in the way that I'm about to demonstrate to you. Yeah, love org mode. I can hide and show all of these. I get syntax highlighting for the code that's in here. I can also add things like to-do states to track if I've completed a certain section or what state it's in. All of the math actually gets written here in org mode and LaTeX to make it much easier. Yeah, it's just, to me, it is the way to author complex technical narratives. And that's the whole reason why I've set the framework up in such a way to basically be using org mode as the source of truth for the narrative, and then Svelte and SvelteKit as the presentation and deployment layers. So before moving to the toolbar at the top, I just wanted to discuss some of these things at the bottom. This is all relatively standard. We have contact information, so if you want to email me or if you want to look at my LinkedIn, you can click on these links. If you want to, actually I'll get back to this one in a second because there's some details there. If you want to share this post, you can share it on a variety of platforms. Clicking any of these will automatically open a share interface in one of these applications to make it easier to share this across whatever your favorite social media platform is. And then to the right here, we've got an RSS feed. As an Emacs user, I use lfeed, so RSS is a big part of my information consumption workflow. And then we've also got a subscribe button here, which will allow you to subscribe to a newsletter, which is, I would say, just an analogous way to get subscription to the content that I publish on this blog. So if you want to keep up with what I'm posting, you can subscribe to either of these things. And then there's some basic copyright information below. Nothing on this blog is intended to be monetized. There might be a few exceptions to that. This copyright is really the de facto copyright. When anyone publishes anything to the internet, it's default covered by a copyright, and this is just referencing what that law is. So I just wanted to make that transparent, as anytime you publish anything on a personal blog, it's copyrighted by default. So that's the bottom toolbar. So now we can talk about some interesting things at the top here. So we'll see all these icons here to the right. So we have search. This is full text search. So if I click on this and I type in, let's say, the word perfection, because I know that this is going to get me to one of my favorite quotes in this document, and then I click that, it'll take me to that section where that match occurs. So this is in quotes intuitively, and the quote that I really like is, "Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away." Might seem super ironic as there's a lot going on the screen right now, but we'll actually practice what this is preaching in a minute when we look at one of the other features. So that's full text search. That's powered by Algolia, which is a pretty, I would say that's kind of the first choice for most people implementing this. And of course, my use case is not that intense because this is a personal blog. This isn't a massive corpus of text like a wiki or anything like that. I also have an implementation of Control F. This is basically intended to be a nicer version of Control F. and it has the ability to do fuzzy matching as well. So feel free to give that a go, or you can just use basic Control F. You'll notice if you hover over this that I haven't overwritten that key binding. I need to make this icon a little bit more intuitive, but what this is a link preview. So with the link preview turned off, the website behaves normally, but with it turned on, any link that you hover over will have a preview that appears. And not only that, the preview is actually hierarchical, or I should say recursive. So typically sites that implement this feature, like I know you can turn this on Wikipedia and Google, they will only let you preview 1 degree out from the site that you're currently on. And that's typically due to how iframes are implemented. But this is actually setting up a proxy server such that I can sort of host these websites in a way to get around those limitations. So we can see an example of this. So if I hover over, let's say, Emacs org mode, we see that we have a preview that'll pop up. And it's not going to be the most pretty rendering of this because, again, this is proxied. Most sites, basically, the preview would stop here, but what we can see is I can hover over another link in this website, and then I get another preview show up, and I can keep going and going and going until, my heart's content, and then I can mouse out of the previews and they all disappear. So the idea behind this is that if you see something that interests you, maybe you don't know what Svelte is, you can mouse over that concept, and then you can read a little bit about it. And then if you need to get a little bit more insight into things that are linked to in these subpages, you can do that as well without having to sort of dig super, super deep into several different browser tabs and then have to sort of walk that all the way back. This is really just kind of putting that functionality a little bit more at your fingertips. I tend to leave this switched off because it can be a visual distraction. You'll notice that anything that is a link will render a preview page, and it even works for links to internal posts and even internal sections, right? So if we hover over, let's say, this why include HUD section, it will actually show us a preview of that part of the document. So we can even use this to preview content even at the section level throughout this blog if we want to. But as I mentioned, I typically leave this turned off. So now let's apply that concept of perfection is when nothing is left to take away rather than nothing left to add. So all of these sideline components can be hidden. You can hide them one by using these icons here. And these will explain what they are in the tooltip, which doesn't seem to be working now. I think that might be still deploying. I literally just added that in. But there's also some visual analogy here between the icon you'll see up here and the icon that's in each of these HUD components. So we can see this table of contents icon here. We can see the tag icon here. The corresponding icon up here will actually hide that part of the interface. And we can see that it's doing it dynamically. The grid that all of this is sitting in is actually rearranging itself to accommodate the presence or absence of certain components. So I can toggle off a few here if I want. Let me actually bring the TLDR back in. So let me build, let's say, an intuitive layout consisting of really only what I would want to see. So I'm going to turn off backlinks and forward links. I'm going to turn tags back on. I'm going to leave the footnotes on because I don't want to have to do scrolling up and down or anything like that. I'm going to hide the bibliography. Oops, that's the TLDR. I'll hide the bibliography. And maybe I'll hide the minimap as well. So this could be my customized version of this contextualized reading experience based on only the features that are important to me. I'm going to turn these back on and then also show you how you can get a really minimalized version of this website with a single click by pressing this button here, which is going to hide all of the sideline components. And then it's going to render this in what should be wider. I'll fix that. But it'll render just the article content here. And so you can read this as you would read anything else. I'm going to turn all of those sideline features back on. And then anything that you want displayed, you might not want the auto following feature because it can be quite distracting, right? It sort of grabs your attention away from the main article view. And so what you can do to disable that is you can turn off the auto scroll feature. And when I do that, we'll notice that the only thing that's actually updating here is the viewport and the minimap, but the minimap actually doesn't scroll. So that can give you a much more sort of static experience as you're scrolling through the document and can minimize distractions there. I'm going to scroll up to the top. Let me turn that back on. We can see these accessibility features here again. I won't cover those. And then the last icon to cover here is this one, which is presentation mode. And what that does is that's going to render the entire article as a slideshow presentation, and that's using something called Reveal.js. This is a somewhat flexible implementation of that, in that typically in Reveal.js slides, it will force you to write only so much content per slide such that everything fits in. But I've made these scrollable because I want to make this a generic solution. And if I have, let's say, a lot of narrative in a particular section, I want that to be visible via the slideshow mode. And we can see this is somewhat hierarchical here, right? So this section, what is going on in the sidelines, has subsections, and the way that you can drill down into that is by using the arrows, and there's a helpful guide here. So I can drill down, and then I can see these subsections here as well. And I can move on to the next top-level section, and so on and so forth. And interactive elements, things that, like plotly charts that we might want to interact with, those all work in the slideshow mode as well. This can be really useful if you have a data-driven presentation that you're giving. It's actually pretty uncommon when people do PowerPoints that you can actually interact with the data that's being represented in the visualization. So I'm pretty happy with that feature. So I'm going to exit out of the PowerPoint mode. And then just to cover the last, this probably is part of the heads-up display, but here you have something that I've called a breadcrumb, which represents essentially the level that you're in the blog, down to the actual section that you're reading in the article's outline. So we can see here, as I'm in this like HUD components section, I can see that I've got this representation of like, this is part of the whole site. If you click on this element, it'll take you back to the home page, but this is part of my blog. It tells you the post that you're on. It doesn't render the full title because I need to be space saving here. And then it tells you the path, basically the outline path for where you are in the article. So here we can see what's going on in the sidelines, why include HUD, components. And this also comes out in the table of contents. But I also like this visual representation because this is what a lot of people are used to, especially if they use a text editor like VS Code or Emacs or something like that. Breadcrumbs are typically displayed like this to be able to orient you to where you are in the document. There's very few other features worth mentioning. I think they've all been covered. I don't think I discussed that you can hide and show headlines. And then just a couple like sort of relevant pieces of the content here. I'm able to render mathematical equations. For this, I'm using something called MathJax. That's really useful. Here I'm able to render GIFs. I can render GIFs that are like sort of local files on my machine that then get built into the web application. And I can also render GIFs. These are all coming from Giphy. I don't own any of these. I can render GIFs from Giphy here as well. All super responsive, really nice. I find that, like these are here sort of as a laugh, but I find that a lot of the time, especially if you're demonstrating something on your computer, like within Emacs, for example, it's useful to include a GIF showing that interaction so people can see how your application actually works. I've already talked about Plotly charts. Plotly is built on top of D3. D3 is used all over my blog. It's a brilliant way to interact with data visualizations, and their library of visualizations is huge. In order to interact with these, you want to be able to, and there's a little visual guide here, you need to be able to click to interact. I added that feature because when you're scrolling through this document, the chart will actually capture your cursor, and then you'll be stuck scrolling inside of the visualization. So after you click to interact, you can see these nice hoverovers. That's really cool. You can play around with the Plotly chart, and then if you want to see it in a modal, you can actually click this and it renders in a much larger form, and it renders with the Plotly toolbar, so you can do things like downloading it as a PNG, different types of selection, interactions, all good stuff like that. So I can exit out of this, and then I can either press escape to exit the interaction, or I can kind of click that lock button so I can get my cursor back. This also supports things like animations. This is why I use Plotly. It's an incredibly rich way to represent data, and it's incredibly interactive. Worth mentioning that Plotly, which is written on top of D3, D3 is also what's powering the knowledge graph that we saw on the homepage. So I'm going to go ahead and hit escape to lock that chart. And Plotly can also do things like render 3D charts. So even if your use case is extremely powerful, Plotly can handle it, which is cool. Scroll down. Let's see. Can also do things like rendering mermaid charts. This is really useful. Although these are static outputs, I find that this is oftentimes the best way to communicate simple things like system architecture. What else? And this is where kind of Emacs org mode comes into play. So everything we've seen up until now is not necessarily exclusive to Emacs or org mode. This is where org mode really shines. There's this concept called literate programming, which anyone who's used something like a Jupyter notebook would be familiar with this, which is that you can mix narrative and code together, and the code is actually executable. It's really common in the scientific domains because it supports things like reproducible research, but it's also just extremely convenient. It wouldn't be the way that you would write software in general, but I think certainly for any kind of technical narrative, having the ability to write code and then execute it in line with the rest of your narrative is massively convenient. So I've included some examples of that here. What else? Oh yeah, a little note about link styling. So in order to represent different types of links, I've broken them down into roughly 3 categories. So one is external links, so links to other sites. And we can see intuitive examples of that here, where I'm linking to the Svelte documentation. And then we can also see links to pages that are part of this blog. Those get a dashed underline. So basically, if you're clicking on something that takes you to a route in this blog, it will have a dashed underline. And if you're clicking on a link that takes you to a section within this page, which is fairly common for there to be these sort of internal references, that'll have a dotted underline. So that helps you to kind of visually distinguish between sort of where is this link going to take me. What else? Trying to see oh yeah, there's tables, relatively intuitive things, the same kind of click to interact type of thing here. For example, this is a really long table. This is a pretty common machine learning data set. So you can click to interact and then scroll through the data, which is nice. Going down, you can include things like images, nothing crazy there. Also things like iconography. These icons are difficult to see because the text is not rendering these properly. I can fix this styling, but the point is that you can use libraries like file icons in order to get, really any kind of icon you would imagine here. Most of these are for things like, programming languages or technologies or things like that. Can just help to add a little bit of visual style to the blog. So that's quite a long section, so I'm going to skip past that. And then finally here, we have the ability to embed YouTube videos. Right now, I've included this one called Big Buck Bunny. This is part of the Creative Commons, I believe, so there's no copyright infringement committed by me for including this in the blog temporarily. But yeah, quite useful. For example, this video is going to be posted on YouTube, but that's not really the place that I want people to watch it. I want them to watch it on my blog, right? It's good for both myself and YouTube, because then my blog is getting traffic and YouTube is also getting traffic by virtue of the video being played from within my blog. So that is basically the long and short of it. Yeah, again, this site was built with Emacs org mode. That's sort of the narrative engine. And then Svelte and SvelteKit are essentially the sort of like the visual presentation layer. And specifically SvelteKit is what helps me to turn this into something that's kind of fully deployable and something that adheres to sort of web development best practices. You can read a lot more about those technologies by following these links, but I've also laid out a very detailed design decisions document where I go through each of the technologies I use, and it's not just Emacs org mode SvelteKit. There's a whole bunch of other things that were selected along the way. That's what the TLDR will help you get a good idea of what's been used. And in each section, I've essentially been very careful to mention sort of what is the situation that led to me leaning on a technology, the task that technology is meant to be accomplishing for me, what I needed to do in order to get that technology working. So you might see a lot of code vignettes in here, and then some verbiage about what was accomplished by selecting that technology. And in addition to that, I've tried to be explicit about why I didn't select other technologies, right? So why did I select org mode over Markdown? Why did I select Svelte over React or Vue, etc.? All those details are included here. So if you want any kind of advice or idea on how you would implement something like this yourself, you can read it in this document. As of the time of recording this video, I haven't decoupled the content management piece of this blog and open sourced that, but I will. So that would probably be better or more useful than this document, because it wouldn't be something you have to read through and then implement yourself. You will eventually be able to use my content management system, and then the only thing that you would have to do is manage the deployment, which would be mostly figured out for you, and then of course produce and publish the content. So yeah, that's it. It's the whole blog. I plan to add posts to this quite regularly. Part of the purpose of this is as an exhaust for my ideas and thoughts, and to also help me get certain proof of concept projects out into the open source in an MVP state, so that I can start potentially assaying interest in the community, or hopefully, creating something that is useful or educational to someone, and having them help me carry that forward if it does end up being useful. So yeah, again, you can reach out to me. All my contact information's here. Happy to answer any questions you have, or hop on a call to explain anything that I've built. But yeah, happy reading.